Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah! Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston, and we just cannot get through a week without the hypocritical MAGA Michigan Republican Party getting into some kind of trouble. As I talked about last week, right-winger State House Representative Neil Frisky of Charlevoix found himself in some trouble and got arrested for a shots fired and sexual assault complaint. A police spokesman told the Daily Beast that Frisky was suspected of a felony-level offense. Now, Frisky is telling everyone that he was framed, of course, and it's also the liberal media's fault. You see, the party of personal responsibility once again complains that their poor decisions are someone else's fault. Sounds a little familiar when it comes to MAGA, does it not? The Michigan Information and Research Service, a local independent news outlet, cited anonymous sources in reporting that the incident had allegedly involved Frisky chasing an adult dancer after a disagreement while brandishing a gun, according to the Daily Beast. So, Frisky recently attended a candidate forum because he's being primaried, and that's where he decided to talk about the incident, somewhat. And that's also where he maintained his innocence. Listen.
I'm thrilled to be anywhere that's not a jail cell. Let me first address the elephant in the room, and let me be as clear as I possibly can be. I was arrested and held due to some false accusations. I was released with no charges. I did absolutely nothing wrong. And I'm certain that when the police are done conducting their investigation, I will be completely exonerated. So far, this has not been a miscarriage of justice. It's been a miscarriage of the media.
He was released without charges, although Lansing police continue to investigate the so-called law and order candidate. This is all going to be revealed soon, so I'm not exactly sure how this is all going to turn out, making Frisky looking all that good. I mean, seriously, what was he doing out after 2 a.m., and what's he doing with an adult dancer? Usually, Neil Frisky is trying to make women surrender their freedoms to the government when it comes to their health and economic means. I talked about this recently, but let me bring it up again. Frisky told a radio station when he was running for the State House seat back in 22 that he just couldn't understand why we need to write up abortion bans that provide exceptions for women whose health is in danger during childbirth. Frisky said that he just didn't get why doctors couldn't save both the woman and the fetus. He could have contacted a local OBGYN, but I guess it's easier to be ignorant, I suppose. Listen to him talk to our good friends from the Still Social as he tried using the favorite right-wing talking point about abortion after birth. Listen.
I am 100% pro-life. These partial birth abortion bills that are coming are a travesty.
You mentioned partial birth abortions. Can you talk to our audience about what that actually means?
Yeah. Well, to be honest with you, I don't have a definite medical definition of that.
Oh, this is the best and the brightest MAGA Republicans are bringing to the dance. No, not a stripper's dance. It reminds me of when I was hosting my last radio job in Saginaw. There was a local talk show we had, and I got to host for an hour. The host is a MAGA Republican, so when he would leave for the day and I got to fill in, it was always a splendid time for me because all I had to do was say, "Hello, everyone," and the station's right-winger MAGA callers would flood the phone lines, and it was just an easy way to spend an hour. Anyway, I'll never forget this one caller who wanted to talk about Proposition 3 in 2022, which, of course, was the abortion rights ballot initiative in Michigan. And the caller spewed all the fake right-wing talking points about the proposition, including that it allowed abortion after birth, to which I responded, "Isn't that called murder by the letter of the law? I mean, that's the law. That would be murder." Not to mention, of course, that it's never done. I'll never forget, though, when my boss, who supports abortion bans, walked into the studio during a break and told me, we don't agree on the issue, but you're absolutely right. If a baby is actually born, then killed, it's murder. I mean, what's this guy talking about? And that was my boss who said that. And I just looked at it this way. It just showed how insanely extreme and radical MAGA Republicans have become and their desire to punish women. Which is why I have to mention that we did have some great news this week when the Michigan Court of Claims ruled that the state's draconian and wicked Republican 24-hour waiting period for women who wanted to receive an abortion and laws that also mandated that women look at pictures of fetuses and adoption information, the Court of Claims ruled that those laws were unconstitutional due to the state's abortion rights amendment. And we can thank voters for that who cemented abortion rights in the state constitution in 2022. Remember, Republicans passed those laws to hurt women. The Democratic majority was able to negate many of those Republican trap laws last year, but one Democratic State House member, Karen Whitsitt, refused to budge on the 24-hour waiting period, so that law stayed until now. That law served to hurt and prevent women from obtaining abortion services. Thankfully, the Court of Claims made the right call, and women in this state no longer have to adhere to such hurtful and hateful Republican anti-reproductive freedom laws. However, that could all change if dear leader Trump wins and Republicans gain control of the U.S. Senate while holding the House. Abortion bans could be on the table, and that would nullify everything that we've done here in the state. I wanted to thank last week's guest, Democratic State Representative Jason Morgan, for joining the show and talking about his plans to divert money going into the corporate slush fund known as the SOAR Fund, and instead committing some of that money into public transit and housing. But as I also stated last week, fellow progressive Democrats Emily Devendorf and Dylan Wagella are fighting to direct even more money into affordable housing. Now, the legislature is working on finalizing its state budgets, and I heard Democratic State Senator Mallory McMorrow tell her Twitter followers how the transit bills may be put on hold until after they return from their summer break. Still, even though there's some more negotiating that has to be done, I'm happy that Democrats are working to make much-needed investments in public transit, which this state so badly needs. It really does. I mean, if we're about diversifying our state economy, we've got to be about diversifying our modes of transportation. This isn't the 20th century anymore. It costs way too much. It's way too expensive to be fixing the damn roads all of the time. We don't have the resources. And if we are really, truly, honestly trying to make some changes in the state for the 21st century, especially if we're about making this a more attractive place for businesses and young people, then we have to invest in public transit. I'll talk about that more in 2 weeks when Democratic State Representative Carrie Reingans returns to the show. I'm taking next week off for 4th of July. 4th of July is on a Thursday. Usually a new show drops every Thursday, so I'm deciding to give myself just a little break. Don't worry, though. Next week I will have a Monday Musing and also a Friday Short. But in 2 weeks, State Representative Carrie Reingans will be back here on the show, and I'm looking forward to that. The presidential debate is happening on Thursday, and I'll have more to say about it in my Friday Short this week, but I think Michigan Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer had a perfect description of this race between President Biden and the failed and convicted former president, dear leader Trump. And Whitmer told Michigan Advance, and I'm going to quote here if you don't mind, she said, "I think the cost of living is higher now, and while we're seeing inflation coming down and we've got historic employment numbers and a president who's actually gotten more done for this country than many of his predecessors, people are still, I think, working really hard to keep their heads above water. And I think that's the stress that the average person's feeling. And that comes out, I think, in anxiety about the state of things. All that being said, when you actually take a look at the two choices, the two fundamental choices in front of us, there's a very stark difference. One, the incumbent president who's focused on making people's lives better, and another who's focused on making his own life better. Wow. I mean, where's she wrong in that assessment? She's not wrong at all. And it's something that Biden should echo at the debate. He's about making people's lives better, while Trump is only about making his life better. Trump's presidency is a transactional presidency. How can he enrich himself? And he'll enrich himself while destroying democracy. And can I just say this too? I really wish that she could have run this year. Don't get me wrong, I'm voting for Biden over the economic and democracy-destroying Donald Trump, but I do believe that she would decimate that cranky and old uncle who just spews nonsensical crap at the Thanksgiving table. Now, Whitmer's political ascendancy has really put the Lansing area more in the spotlight as the Democratic Party leadership here in the state, and the strength of the Democratic Party has moved a bit from the Detroit area to the Ingham County area. Nitish Pahwa from Slate magazine wrote an article on how Lansing is now the new locus of political power in the state, and that could really help lead Democrats to victory, not just in Michigan, but across the country this November. He's joining me here in just a moment to talk about his article and what he thinks about the political influence his hometown now holds here throughout the state. And stand by, because after the interview, this week's Last Call segment will ask the question, what is a moderate? Nitish Pahwa from Slate magazine is coming up right after this quick break. You're listening to LOL.
A podcast that believes in using common sense to move Michigan into the future. And by common sense, we mean progressive sense. We've all seen what 40 years of Republican leadership did to this state, and we refuse to go back. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. You can follow Pat on Facebook or X. Pat still calls it Twitter. Or on the Gram, Threads, and also on YouTube. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. All right, I think we gave Pat enough time to catch his breath. Let's get back to it. Here's Pat Johnston.
That's right, as you just heard Jessica say, Left of Lansing is also now on YouTube. You can subscribe there as well, as episodes are being posted there. And soon I will start posting some actual videos, including videos of my interviews with various guests. I'm going to do that here soon, but I am in the process of fixing up the Left of Lansing studios, otherwise known as my attic, before I can really start posting some videos. So just sit tight for that. But that's how we're trying to make the show more accessible to everyone, even though, yes, I do have a face for radio. All right, I'm pleased to have Nitish Pahwa on the show this week. Nitish is the associate writer for business and tech at Slate.com. And I believe, Nitish, that is in New York, correct?
Yes, we're based in New York. We also have office in DC.
Okay, just want to make sure. And Nitish recently published a piece about how his home area of Lansing is gaining more and more political power and clout here of late in Michigan, and how it could also be the epicenter of the fight for not just Michigan's preservation for democracy, but also the entire country's. The title of the Slate article is "The City That Will Determine Where Michigan and the Country Goes in 2024. I'm happy to introduce Nitish Pahwa here on this week's episode of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. Nitish, welcome, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pat.
All right, before we get to your article, would you mind talking about your time here in Michigan? Because I think you said that you grew up here. Is that correct?
So I grew up first in northern Michigan, around West Branch. After around middle school or so, my family and I moved to the greater Lansing area. We were in Meridian Charter Township, and then I went to Michigan State. And then after I got a job to New York, I moved out here, but Lansing is always near and dear to me.
What made you want to examine Michigan's political scene here in this article, and, you know, particularly the political scene in Ingham County, let's say?
So it was just a random thing I kind of noticed going into this election cycle. And I do, despite my job title, I do help out relatively often with political coverage at Slate. So I was looking at stuff in Michigan for the upcoming election cycle. I mean, it's obviously been a very talked about state already, very important for the fall. But what I noticed that a lot of people didn't seem to be talking about was that so many of the real high stakes Michigan elections have been taking place around the Lansing area. It was not just the gubernatorial races where obviously Michigan State alum Gretchen Whitmer took the helm, but there is going to be the Senate race where we have two former representatives of the area facing off against each other for the seat, Mike Rogers, Alyssa Slotkin. I found out from the Cook Political Report and from some other resources that the district where my parents currently live, which Slotkin currently represents in the House of Representatives, is going to be one of the tightest, one of the defining races for this cycle. So I thought it's interesting that Lansing is actually a pretty important epicenter right now, and I don't think a lot of people outside of Michigan realize that. So I wanted to bring more attention.
Just to get back to more of your personal story here first, when did you move out of the state?
I moved out in late 2017. I graduated Michigan State spring 2017, but I was around and working in the area for a little bit. And then when I got the job at Slate, I flew out to New York. But like I mentioned, my parents are still in the area. My sister actually just finished up her own undergraduate term at Michigan State. So I've been back very often. I actually did a story a few years ago for Slate about the Chipotle union organizing effort that took place in Lansing. I mentioned to my editor, I was like, hey, that's very close to my parents' backyard. So he allowed me to do the story, and I was very psyched to do that.
Okay, I was just trying to get a bearing of when that happened because so in 2017, Rick Snyder was still our governor. The Republicans still had the state trifecta. So this real massive change that has happened here in Michigan, and I want to say it started in 2018, obviously, with one of the big blue waves that first big blue wave that happened there. Are you surprised to see that kind of turnover happen? And more particularly, maybe of where you grew up. Did you ever think you'd see a time where Democrats would not only, gain more of like this political clout from people from that area around Ingham County and, around Lansing and everything, but also are you just surprised that Democrats have been able to find ways to be more competitive in those areas?
Yeah, no, I absolutely was surprised because I mean, the Snyder administration was a very formative time for me growing up around the area. I was extremely kind of, to understate it, I was pretty unhappy with a lot of how the Snyder administration was going. And then, when he won re-election 2014 and when, Republican control of the state house just continued to seem inevitable, I didn't really think that Michigan was coming back too quickly from that. And of course, 2016, the state voted for Trump. But yeah, the 2018 election was a huge surprise from my parents' district flipping. That was when Slotkin won over Mike Bishop. That was, of course, Whitmer ascending to the governor's chair. And I mean, yeah, 2022 just brought even more gains. And I think it's also worth noting in the 2018 election cycle, you had those ballot initiatives, including, the redistricting commission, legalizing weed, etc. It felt like Michigan was finally going in a better direction as soon as I left. But I wanted to make sure, I kept an eye on developments and everything emanating from there.
I just want to say, too, for maybe those not familiar here with this podcast or maybe with Michigan's political scene, Nitish, you just brought up the anti-gerrymandering ballot initiative that passed in 2018. I've had on one of the big advocates for that. His name is Joe Spalding, and he went around and he helped with the petition process. And everybody does talk about how Democrats did really well because of the hard work they did, and that is true. But it was also the people here in the state, I think, who were sick and tired of the gerrymandering and that there was really no way to break that Republican stronghold. I think that the people have to also get a lot of credit for getting that passed and for opening up the democratic process here in the state and getting rid of that lock that Republicans had here in the state for so many years.
Exactly. I really give them all my credit. A lot of these people who did not give up on Michigan did not accept these heavily gerrymandered maps as inevitable or just stuck in place and saw where winds could potentially be shaping. And I think you've definitely seen Michigan benefit so much from that.
Right. And I think that's where people have to understand across the country that here in Michigan, due to our state constitution, we the people, we have the power to put certain issues on the state ballot and we can override what happens in the state legislature on a number of issues. For instance, with legalization of marijuana, anti-gerrymandering, opening up voting rights, abortion rights. I mean, so many things that we can throw onto the state ballot. And unfortunately, other states, they don't have that kind of capability because the ballot initiative is not enshrined in their state constitution. So I feel sorry for some of those states. Nitish, in your article that you wrote about growing up here in the state of Michigan, you also talked about political power, especially on the Democratic Party side, for years and years and years and years resided in Detroit or the Metro Detroit area. And that was true, obviously, and continues to be. But you rightly do point out how Governor Gretchen Whitmer made a name for herself by being a state legislator from the Lansing area. And looking back, I do believe her political ascendancy was really helped by the fact that she was from the Lansing area and not just another Detroit Democrat. Again, I'm not bad-mouthing Metro Detroit Democrats one bit, as I've had many on my show. We need Metro Detroit Democrats since that's where the population is. The majority of the population in Michigan is in that area. So please don't misconstrue what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I think Whitmer being from Lansing allowed her to sort of connect with both Metro Detroiters. And also, because of being from Lansing, it allowed her to connect with rural voters across the state as well. Would you see it the same way?
Yeah, that's a interesting one. I remember that you'd have sometimes local Lansing officials more at the municipal level, either running for that district or running for the governorship. But I do think in 2018, a lot of political tides had changed. There were a lot of very disgusted people who wanted to push back on what 8 years of this Republican administration had brought. And I remember for Whitmer, I attended the 2017 Women's March in Lansing when that got kicking off earlier in the year. And I remember seeing her give a speech there. I think she was great about using her voice, making sure she was out there in the right forums. And I think she also could claim, even though she very obviously was a political insider at that point, having been House Minority Leader for Michigan, she could also still claim a bit of a outsider status, right? She was coming into this promising something a lot newer and a lot fresher than how stuff had been run within the state for so long. And I think her Lansing background, it would be interesting to find out whether, that was a true asset, but I don't think it hurt at all.
No, I don't think so either. You described the fight for Michigan's 7th Congressional House District, the one that Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin's vacating for her Senate run, which we will get to here in just a second. But that one is proving to be a marker for the rest of the nation this fall. And, it'll most likely be a battle between Democrat Curtis Hertel Jr., a former state senator and son of a former House Speaker, and Republican Tom Barrett, another former state senator who lost to Slotkin in 2022. And let me remind everyone out there, Barrett's also an election denier and even went as far as traveling to the Trump White House and trying to find ways to overturn the election. Now, part of this district is in the Lansing area, and millions of dollars are just pouring in to this House seat. So what does this race signify for you, Nitish, not just in Michigan, but also for what it could mean for the rest of the country?
I mean, I think a big thing that helped to shift the way things went down in 2018 and 2020 and 2022 was that district, especially, there's a lot of suburbs. And of course, we saw suburban voters really start shifting away from Trump and Republicans beginning after his initial election. You have a big municipal area, you have the big college campus, but now you've got the added help of suburban voters who were disgusted by the Trump years and really wanted to help swing in something different. Putting it like that, you think you can look back and maybe the tide was always heading that direction, but I still can't say I expected it. I unfortunately, now living in New York, where I feel like I have to be the Michigan explainer for all my friends here who are not from Michigan or have never been. They know Detroit, they know Ann Arbor, they've probably heard some stuff about maybe Traverse City or up north. Lansing just never really registers for them, and I never thought it would. But now I think it's a promising sign to see Lansing start to resonate more politically and culturally.
Listen, Nitish, I really want to talk about New York politics and the New York Democratic Party, but I'm going to hold that question until the end here because there is this race for the retiring Senator Debbie Stabenow's seat. The front runner for that race as of now is Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, and on the Republican side, it's former Congressman Florida Mike Rogers. And Nitish, we call him Florida Mike Rogers here because after retiring from Congress, Rogers escaped to Florida, where he made loads of cash in the defense contracting business before flying back here to run for the Senate. But it has not been an easy run for him so far because right out of the gate, when he was on a political show here, he didn't know much about how voters enshrined abortion rights in our state's constitution. So right out of the gate, it just showed that he had no clue. And what was happening here in Michigan, he didn't have his fingers on the pulse of what was happening in Michigan. And I don't think he really understood how much Michigan had changed since he left. Still, despite all that, he got the endorsement of dear leader Trump, even though Rogers at one time said that he would never, ever back Trump at all. I mean, it's very, very embarrassing. So this is going to be a competitive race probably, but if both Slotkin and Rogers do prevail in their primaries, I think like Stabenow and Whitmer, Alyssa Slotkin, despite some progressives having issues with her, she will still benefit from being in a district that's both suburban and rural. What's your take?
Yeah, I've been very fascinated by the way Slotkin has campaigned, has represented the seat, the way she's like really, become a name in Congress. She understood she was coming from a swing district that she'd only recently flipped. She was very early on in calling for Trump's impeachment and calling for her fellow House Democrats to get on with the effort. But at the same time, she wanted to, I think, very much avoid, you could say, the politics of division, as it were. She continued to maintain look, I work across the aisle. I still work with colleagues on the issues where we can agree. And she also very much touted the importance of our democracy and preserving it. She brought Liz Cheney to one of her campaign events in East Lansing in 2022. So she definitely has a way of trying to reach out to as much of the district as possible. And I mean, it's a district with everything, right? Like I mentioned earlier, you have a college campus, you have the bigger city and downtown, you've got the rural areas, the farmland stocks, and you have the suburbs. And so with that, it's not easy, obviously, to try to craft a message that gets across the entirety of that expanse, especially as we've heard a lot about rural-urban divides, especially among white voters, divides and ideology based on education, especially. But she, I think, has done a very, very good job sort of straddling, being like a forceful, liberal person while also making sure that she still comes off as, I guess you could say, Midwestern nice. She'll make do with her colleagues, no matter where they're from or what they're doing. It's a really fascinating strategy to witness in motion. And now, I mean, she's going to try to apply it to the whole state. I think the district probably has well prepared her for that. And we'll see whether her fellow Democrats can replicate that success.
I think what Alyssa Slotkin is trying to guarantee to some voters out there is a return to normalcy. She's not exactly touting some kind of huge progressive outlook in a way, and maybe that just comes from the district she's in. Maybe that's also because that's who she is politically. Maybe it's also because she knows that she is trying her best to reach as many voters as possible. At the same time, I have to tell you, Nitish, I was critical of Alyssa Slotkin because of her first Senate ad that she released about a month or so ago. In that ad, she touted her bipartisanship. She showed pictures in her ad with Barack Obama and then also with George W. Bush. Okay, I'm not saying that George W. Bush and Donald Trump are exactly the same, but at the same time, come on now, it's the Republican Party. They were always trending this way. It was always going to become MAGA. George W. Bush and Karl Rove really didn't change any of that. So I guess it's hard for somebody like Slotkin and many Democrats out there to say, look, we're trying to bring us back to some normalcy, but look over there, that party, we can't trust them. They're going to destroy democracy. But hey, by the way, we want to work with them. It just sort of sends some mixed signals, in my opinion. What's your take?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I say all that, it's not to say that I agree with everything Slotkin's been doing or saying, or that like all of it is necessarily like, I think either sound strategy or a good idea.
Right.
It's a very delicate balance, right? If you want to try to win over people who were formerly Republican voters, you probably want to try doing it more in a spirit of just like reaching out instead of like going on the attack about this or that, which I mean, I would say, especially when Republicans like Tom Barrett, have played a little fast and loose with our democratic norms, that's worth going after. I think she does have that knack too, where again, as I mentioned, I think her bringing Liz Cheney, the one of the Republicans who did really speak out against Trump past January 6th, then was ousted for it. That's not a coincidence. That's sending a message like, look, here's someone who from this party who did speak up for their beliefs, and this is what happened to her. And this is why we can't have more of this in the House. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So I hope she will have more messaging of that sort. At least we'll see how it actually plays out. I remain cautiously optimistic, but there's so many things that can change from here until November.
Nitish, in your article you wrote and your conclusion here, and I'm quoting here, you said it's not just that the most important politicians in Michigan hail from the area where I grew up. It's that they're now some of the most important politicians in the entire country. Nothing mid about mid-Michigan. Am I right? I think that you are right. And when you put it that way, if President Biden does win and Democrats regain Congress and Democrats keep the Michigan state legislature blue and maybe help gain other state legislatures, turn blue as well, it'll be due in part because of how well Democrats do here in the state. It really could come down to that. This is, as you've said, the epicenter of just not our state politics, but maybe for the national political scene this November.
Yeah, basically, if you look at just what Whitmer and the Michigan Democrats have been able to accomplish in just the 2 years they've had this trifecta, the first time they've had anything close to this level of power in decades. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. And I think a lot of Michiganders across the state are, pretty relieved by it. Obviously, not everyone. We know that there are people, who had some very violent sentiments toward the governor, unfortunately. But I think for the most part, you've seen that people are excited to have people in power who are looking forward, and they're going to notice the party affiliation of all these people who are driving the state forward. I would be surprised if that doesn't redound on the other Democrats now working toward national office.
Which then leads here to my last question, because despite how MAGA, the Republican Party, has become, Michigan Democrats still had to produce some results by showing voters, by showing all Michiganders that they are helping people. You mentioned in your article, Nitish, about how Whitmer's run a predominantly progressive governorship, although I think that's due in part because of the progressive majority in the state legislatures that has overturned the union killing, right to work for less, by gutting some of the draconian MAGA Republican abortion trap laws, by increasing the state's earned income tax credits for families. Let's see, what else did they do? They passed some ambitious clean energy and clean jobs bills to help make sure that Michigan is carbon-free by 2040 while upgrading the state's energy grid, which is badly needed. They also did it by passing sensible gun safety laws after some of the horrific school shootings that we had to experience here in the state. They did it also by expanding LGBTQ plus civil rights, and that was huge as well. So I think they have built a pretty impressive progressive record here since taking over the state trifecta. So compared to what you see in New York, for example, are you seeing more progressive success here in Michigan, even though the Democratic machine in New York really runs the show for the entire state? And what would you tell Democrats or independents from other states when it comes to Michigan? Because we're doing what I think progressives would love to see happen in their states.
Man, New York over the past few years, right now, I feel like almost every day, everyone I know is like trying to agitate against what's going on in terms of like planned social spending cuts, cuts for public infrastructure and public space, just a full-on austerity regime. Also, just completely shuttering solutions like congestion pricing, which angered me enough that I also wrote about that at Slate, the backtracking on that from our governor. I mean, I am very, very jealous of my home state for having a slightly more forward-thinking approach to a lot of this. I mean, you saw quite a few New York Democrats in city council and the boroughs and the state assembly work really hard to pass and enact wonderful programs on education, on clean energy, on building retrofits, on transit support, housing, all of that. And then you have a lot of people in charge who are just very much waffling on getting that stuff across the finish line. Yeah, I definitely would just love to take a delegation down to Michigan sometime.
Nitish Pahwa, associate writer for business and tech at slate.com. And the article that he wrote that we've been talking about here this week is The City That Will Determine Where Michigan and the Country Goes in 2024. Nitish, thanks so much for being on Left of Lansing this week. It was great talking with you, and I'd love to have you back on again sometime soon. Is that okay?
I would love that. I definitely am going to keep covering Lansing this year, so let's stay in touch. Thanks again for having me.
It's the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. Need to give Pat a piece of your mind? Or do you have some stories you think Pat should cover? Email him at leftoflansing@gmail.com. And if you have Michigan beer ideas for Pat, he'll love you even more. Now, here's Pat.
Well, that's, I think, twice now in about the last 6 weeks, I've invited some national writers who grew up in Michigan to show up here on the pod. I recently spoke with ProPublica's Andy Kroll, who wrote about how the extreme MAGA America First crowd is fighting with the legacy Republicans over the fight for the state Republican Party. And then this week here, I got to talk with Nitish Pahwa of Slate. And in both instances, both of them kind of talked about the changing political dynamics happening here in the state over the last 6 years or so. Those changes happened due to some strong progressive activism to help change the state's right-wing shift of the last 40 years. Those changes also happened due to some good progressives pushing for some new policies and new language and new messaging within the state Democratic Party. And of course, those changes for sure happened due to the extremist right-wing MAGA tilt of the Republican Party. Thanks to all those variables, changes are happening here in Michigan, and it's all happening for the better. Let me know what you thought about my interview with Nitish Pahwa and where you think he nailed some of the things right on the head and where maybe you thought he was wrong in his essay about Michigan's political power structure switching from Detroit to Lansing of late. That's leftoflansing@gmail.com. Time now for the Left of Lansing Last Call. At the conclusion of my talk this week with Nitish Pahwa of Slate magazine, we talked about some differences between the Democratic majorities in Lansing and in Albany, New York. And we recorded the interview just before New York's primary election, in which progressive Democratic Congressman Jamal Bowman lost his primary race. And here's Politico's take on that primary race, and I'm quoting here, Representative Jamal Bowman was trounced in a suburban New York race that became a referendum on progressives' attitudes towards Israel and the most expensive House primary in U.S. history. Moderate Democrat George Latimer bested Bowman on Tuesday by 17 points with 88% of the vote in, making Bowman the first member of the squad to lose an election since the far-left group formed in 2018, unquote. Now, I will give the Politico reporters credit for pointing out how that was the most expensive House primary race in our nation's history, as the pro-Israeli lobbying group known as AIPAC flooded the Latimer campaign with $14 million. Now, I'm not sure I really have much to say about that particular race since I don't live in New York. I don't have much knowledge of the districts or the inner political machinery that's happening there in New York whatsoever. I will say perhaps two things are true. One, that Congressman Bowman wasn't the best politician. Pulling the fire alarm in Congress probably didn't help either. And he's just not that smooth as, let's say, an AOC is when it comes to political talent. I think another thing is true, though, that you can say that AIPAC gave Vladimir millions because of Bowman's anti-right-wing Israeli government stance, and that helped Vladimir in that race as well. Two things can be true. But there's also something else I want to tackle here, and it's something I've asked before. In that Politico article, the reporters described George Vladimir as moderate, and they described the squad faction of the Democratic Party as the far left group. So my question is, what is a moderate? I've asked this question throughout my years of working in conservative talk radio as a liberal voice, and I never, ever really got any concrete answers or any concrete responses, ever. I remember in my last radio job in Saginaw, the longtime conservative host there, he and I would have discussions about JFK. The conservative host, who was an adult when JFK died, held Kennedy in high regard despite being a Democrat because the host was Republican. And he would constantly tell me that if JFK were alive today, he'd be a Republican. I'm certain many of you have heard such claims, and it's something I've heard throughout my near quarter century in talk radio. But when you present them with some facts, concrete policy facts, they remain stuck, or maybe this is a better way of saying it, they refuse to let go of that idea, of that myth that JFK would be a Republican today. I mean, hell, his younger brother, Ted Kennedy, became known as the liberal lion of the Senate. Yet I'm to believe that JFK would have buddied up with Dick Cheney, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, dear leader Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and the entire MAGA crowd. Really? I'm supposed to really believe that? The guy who personally took on U.S. Steel when it turned its back on its agreement with union workers would be MAGA today? Really? The guy who authorized collective bargaining rights for federal union workers, the guy who proposed Medicare, which Ronald Reagan declared to be socialism, and the guy who proposed civil rights would be a Republican today? He'd be all MAGA? Are you serious? In fact, with what I just told you, he'd be considered an AOC leftist today by many in the MAGA crowd. Which leads me again back to my question, what is a moderate? Sub-question, what does a moderate do to help improve the lives of many in this country? I've asked those questions many times. Again, I don't get any kind of real concrete answers. Bowman was pro-ceasefire, pro-union, pro-worker, pro-public education, and pro-women's health and economic rights. When did those positions become far left, as Politico would call it? George Vladimir is considered the moderate choice by Politico, but what makes him moderate? Does backing the extreme right-wing Israeli government make someone a moderate? Does saying that you refuse to back President Biden's plans to tax the rich make someone a moderate? Does signaling that you aren't on board for an excess profit tax on corporations make someone a moderate? Does refusing to say you'd back Medicare for all, does that make one a moderate when the current system isn't affordable and isn't sustainable for average Americans? Is that what makes you a moderate? No one can explain to me what exactly makes a person moderate. For example, many called West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin a moderate, even though he refused to extend the expanded child tax credit, which helped cut child poverty in half in 2021 and 22 and lifted over 177,000 children here in Michigan out of poverty. Yet, I'm told that he was a moderate. How does increasing human and moral suffering make someone a moderate? How does refusing to back a federal minimum wage hike of $15 make someone a moderate? I mean, we've seen the numbers. With inflation, the minimum wage should be around $20 or so, even more. So $15, that seems kind of weak in a way. But yet I'm told that is the moderate position. How does criticizing those calling for a ceasefire in Gaza make one a moderate? Is that what moderation is? Increasing and prolonging human suffering? Look, moderation, good at times, like not eating pizza and donuts every day. That's good. You should do that stuff in moderation. Or drinking a 6-pack of beer every day, not good. Maybe you should cut back a bit. Drinking in moderation is always better. Or maybe, kicking a field goal rather than going for it on every 4th down sometimes is a better idea, Dan Campbell. So yes, moderation, I guess, does have its points, does have its merits. But when has moderation on a political level ever really helped? I think back to the Obamacare debate when the so-called late moderate Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman refused to back Obamacare if it kept a public insurance option. So that public insurance option got scrapped out of the final bill, and millions of lives were hurt and made worse because of it. But that was the so-called moderate position. I think back to when Rick Snyder was considered a moderate Republican when he ran for Michigan governor back in 2012. But yet his moderation led to passing the right to work for less bills that destroyed unions here in the state for a while, gutting living wages for working families, the Flint water crisis, making it harder for citizen-led initiatives to reach the ballot, gutting paid sick leave, giving the crooked school choice crowd whatever it wanted, allowing adoption agencies, I'll say that again, allowing adoption agencies to discriminate against same-sex couples, preventing state environmental standards from exceeding federal standards, and he also worked to prolong the Line 5 oil pipeline at the bottom of the Straits of Mackinac. I mean, that's just to name a few of the so-called policy achievements of the moderate Rick Snyder. But I'm not sure exactly how that is moderation. I mean, you just heard me tell you of Rick Snyder's so-called accomplishments, and they were all designed to increase human suffering. And when it comes to moderation on abortion rights, how does one moderate between giving women health and economic freedoms or choosing that the state should have control over their bodily autonomy? I'm not sure where the moderate choice is there. You're either for freedom or you're not. Since Michigan Democrats took over the state trifecta, abortion rights are codified in the state constitution. Abortion zombie laws are gone. Right to work for less is gone, while the prevailing wage is back, and it's back to help working families. The retirement tax is gone. Clean energy goals and clean energy jobs are back at the forefront again. LGBTQ plus residents gained civil rights protections. Hateful gay conversion therapy is banned. Child marriage is banned. And free meals are offered in Michigan public schools. See, those things are helping improve the lives and improve the economic and environmental futures for the people of Michigan. Now, look, more needs to be done, of course, but I'm still wondering why political reporters and pundits out there, why they believe fighting for fossil fuels and gay conversion therapy is considered the moderate position, while providing meals for kids or paid family leave and sick leave or living wages are considered far left. The thing is, they're considered popular with Michiganders, which is why they are passing and which is why Governor Whitmer is enjoying good approval numbers. Martin Luther King once talked about the white moderate, and he said the white moderate is the one who is devoted to order more than they are to justice. Progressive policies help improve lives by being bold and using common sense. Show me where moderation does the same.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Left of Lansing. Two things I want to quickly bring up. One, earlier on today's episode, you heard me be quite critical of Detroit Democrat Karen Whitsett for blocking an amendment last year that would have ended the 24-hour waiting period for women to receive abortion care. And I've been quite critical of her at other times on this podcast, too. However, that being said, give credit when credit is due. Representative Whitsett scored a major victory for working Michiganders as her bill to extend unemployment benefits from 20 weeks to 26 weeks passed the State House. Now, unemployment benefits used to be 26 weeks, but that was before Rick Snyder and the Republicans cut it to 20. Oh, and by the way, this will come as a shock to everyone, I'm sure. Every House Republican voted against helping working Michiganders. As Michigan advances, Susan Demas tweeted, "The great unraveling of GOP former Governor Rick Snyder's legacy continues as the Michigan House on Wednesday approved a bill increasing unemployment benefits to 26 weeks. And we wonder why the so-called moderate Rick Snyder is working on behalf of putting MAGA Republicans back in power in the legislature. The bill moves on to the Senate. Also, the legislature passed an $83 billion budget, and enough Republicans actually voted to give it immediate effect. So that's good news. We'll talk more about what's in these bills in 2 weeks when I interview Democratic State Representative Carrie Reingans. And another thing I'm bringing up to the representative is how there's reportedly some movement on her bill to have Michigan join the National Popular Vote Compact. Can't wait to talk about that and more with Representative Carrie Reingans here in 2 weeks. Oh, I almost forgot. I've got to give you the Left of Lansing Twitter poll for the week. So here you go. Do you support a plan by some Republicans to end no-fault divorce? Yes, no, I don't know are your answers. Again, that's the Left of Lansing Twitter poll. Everyone have a safe and great 4th of July holiday and just try to relax a bit because it's going to be a busy July, and then after the primaries in August, buckle up. Until then, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan!
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.